The explosion shattered the pre-dawn silence like a thunderclap from hell itself. Captain Elena Vasquez felt the ground beneath her boots tremble as orange flames erupted from Building C7, sending twisted metal and concrete debris raining down across the forward operating base like deadly confetti. The acrid smell of burning fuel and something far worse, something that made her stomach clench with dread, filled the morning air that had been crisp and clean just moments before. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. She was already running before her conscious mind caught up, her combat boots pounding against the packed earth as screams began to pierce the chaos. Behind her, she could hear Sergeant Marcus Chun shouting orders to the scattered soldiers who were stumbling from their barracks, some still in their underwear, others frantically pulling on gear with shaking hands. The base alarm hadn't even begun to wail yet. Elena was moving on pure instinct, that same gut feeling that had kept her alive through 3 deployments and earned her both commendations and reprimands in equal measure. "Vasquez, wait for backup." Chun's voice cracked, with the strain of trying to project authority over the growing pandemonium. But Elena was already at the perimeter of the blast zone. The heat hit her face like opening an oven door, and she could see shapes moving inside the smoke. People trapped, people dying, people who didn't have time to wait for backup. Building C7 housed the communication center, the mess hall, and temporary quarters for a unit of engineers who had arrived just yesterday. Elena's mind calculated the numbers automatically. At least 50 people in the building at the time of the explosion, maybe more. The structure was already compromised, its steel frame twisted into impossible angles, but it hadn't collapsed completely. Not yet. Through the smoke and flames she could see him, General Marcus Harrington, standing 30 yards away near the command bunker, his weathered face illuminated by the hellish glow. Even in crisis, his silver hair was perfectly combed, his uniform impeccable despite being roused from sleep. He was shouting into a radio, probably calling for emergency response teams, following protocol to the letter. His pale blue eyes found hers across the chaos, and Elena saw something flicker there, recognition, calculation, and something that looked almost like disappointment. "Captain Vasquez, stand down, that's an order." His voice carried the weight of 30 years of military command, but Elena had already turned away. She knew what following that order would mean. She had followed orders before, watched good soldiers die because protocol demanded they wait for the all clear, wait for the proper equipment, wait for authorization that came too late. The first person she pulled from the wreckage was Private Jenny Morrison, barely 19 years old, her blonde hair singed and her left arm twisted at an unnatural angle. Jenny's eyes were wide with shock and pain, but she was conscious, grateful, sobbing Elena's name like a prayer as Elena dragged her clear of the building and passed her to Corman Rodriguez, whose steady hands were already reaching for his medical kit. "There are more inside, Captain," Jenny gasped, grabbing Elena's sleeve with her good hand. "The breakfast shift, they were all in the mess hall when it happened. Please." Elena looked back at the building. The flames were spreading, consuming everything in their path, but the structure still held. Through a shattered window she could see figures moving, hear voices calling for help. Behind her she could hear General Harrington's voice growing louder, more insistent, but she couldn't make out the words over the roar of the fire and the hammering of her own heart. Sergeant First Class Maria Santos appeared at her elbow, her dark eyes reflecting the flames. Santos was Elena's closest friend on base, the one person who understood why Elena couldn't just stand there and watch people burn. "I'm with you, Captain," Santos said simply, checking her sidearm and adjusting her tactical vest. "Whatever you're thinking, I'm with you." "This is insane, Maria," Elena said, but she was already moving toward the building again. "We could both end up court-martialed for disobeying direct orders. Then we'll be court-martialed together." Santos replied with a grim smile. Wouldn't be the first time you've gotten me in trouble. They entered the building through a gaping hole that had once been the main entrance. Inside, the smoke was thick enough to choke on, and Elena pulled her shirt up over her nose and mouth, squinting through the haze. The communications equipment was still sparking and smoking, adding an electrical tang to the already overwhelming smell of destruction. Somewhere in the darkness, she could hear voices, some crying out for help, others unnaturally quiet. The mess hall was a disaster zone. Tables and chairs were scattered like toys, some crushed under fallen ceiling tiles, others burned beyond recognition. But there were people there, soldiers caught in the morning meal rush, kitchen staff who had been preparing breakfast. Elena and Santos worked methodically, pulling survivors clear one by one, supporting the walking wounded, carrying those who couldn't move on their own. Each rescue trip took them deeper into the building, further from safety. The heat was becoming unbearable, and Elena could feel her skin starting to burn despite her protective gear. Her lungs felt raw from the smoke, and every breath was a conscious effort. But she kept going, driven by something that went beyond duty or training, something that connected her to every frightened face she pulled from the wreckage. During her fourth trip inside, Elena found herself face to face with Captain James Wheeler, a communications officer she had served with in Afghanistan. Wheeler was pinned under a fallen beam, conscious but fading fast. Blood pooled beneath his head, dark and ominous in the flickering light from the fires. "Elena," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the crackling flames. "My team. They were in the back room when it happened. 3 of them, maybe 4. I can hear them calling, but I can't." Elena examined the beam that had him pinned. It was massive, part of the main support structure, and moving it would require equipment they didn't have and time they couldn't spare. But Wheeler's eyes held a desperate plea that cut through all practical considerations. "I'll find them," she promised, squeezing his shoulder. "Santos, stay with Wheeler. Try to stabilize him." "Captain, the building won't hold much longer," Santos warned, but she was already kneeling beside Wheeler, checking his pulse, applying pressure to his wounds. Elena pressed deeper into the building, following the sound of voices. The back communications room was a maze of destroyed equipment and fallen debris, but she could hear them, 3 voices, maybe 4, calling out from somewhere beneath the wreckage. She began moving debris piece by piece, her hands raw and bleeding from the sharp edges of twisted metal and broken concrete. Outside, she could hear vehicles arriving, fire trucks, ambulances, rescue teams. But she also heard something else. General Harrington's voice, closer now, shouting orders that she knew were meant for her. She could picture him standing at the perimeter, his jaw clenched with frustration, watching his carefully maintained order dissolve into chaos. Elena had served under Harrington for 8 months, and their relationship had been contentious from the start. He was old-school military, a man who believed in chain of command, proper procedure, and following orders without question. Elena respected those principles, but she had also seen what happened when rigid adherence to protocol cost lives. They had clashed before over deployment strategies, over resource allocation, over her tendency to bend rules when lives were at stake. 3 weeks ago, Harrington had called her into his office after she had led an unauthorized rescue mission to extract a wounded translator from a hostile village. The mission had been a success. They had saved the translator and gathered valuable intelligence, but it had also violated standing orders about operating without air support. "Captain Vasquez," Harrington had said, his voice tight with controlled anger, "your heroics may play well with the enlisted personnel, but they're undermining military discipline. If every officer decided for themselves which orders to follow, we wouldn't have an army, we'd have a mob." Elena had stood at attention, staring at the wall behind Harrington's desk where his commendations and photos of past commands were displayed like trophies. "With respect, sir," Sometimes the situation on the ground requires adaptation of standing orders. Adaptation, Captain, not insubordination. There's a difference, and you seem incapable of recognizing it. Harrington had leaned back in his chair, studying her with those pale blue eyes. I'm recommending you for transfer to a desk job stateside. Clearly, field command is not suited to your ... temperament. The transfer had been scheduled for next week. Elena had been preparing to leave the base, to abandon her soldiers and her mission for the safety of a Pentagon office where her decisions wouldn't matter to anyone except filing clerks and procurement officers. The irony wasn't lost on her, that she might be risking court-martial for disobeying the same man who had already decided she wasn't fit for command. She found the first trapped soldier wedged beneath a collapsed wall section, unconscious but breathing. Specialist David Kim. According to his dog tag, she recognized him from the motor pool. Always quick with a joke and quicker with a wrench when vehicles broke down. Elena worked frantically to clear the debris pinning his legs, her muscles screaming with exhaustion and her lungs burning from smoke inhalation. As she lifted Kim and began carrying him toward what remained of the exit, Elena heard a new sound that made her blood freeze, the groaning of stressed metal, the deep, ominous creak that meant the building's support structure was finally giving way. She had minutes, maybe less, before the whole thing came down. Santos appeared beside her, soot-streaked and bleeding from a cut on her forehead, but moving with the same desperate efficiency. That's 23 we've pulled out, she panted. How many more? I don't know, Elena admitted, passing Kim to a pair of medics who had finally been allowed close enough to help with evacuations. But I heard at least 2 more voices from the communications room. Elena, the voice cut through the chaos like a blade. General Harrington was standing 50 feet away, his face flushed with anger and something that might have been fear. I'm ordering you to evacuate that building immediately. It's about to collapse. Elena met his gaze across the smoky distance. For a moment, time seemed suspended between them, 2 soldiers with fundamentally different ideas about duty, about leadership, about the cost of following orders. She could see the other personnel watching, waiting to see if she would finally comply with the general's direct command. Instead, she turned back toward the building. Behind her, she heard Harrington shouting something else, his voice cracking, with what sounded like desperation. But the sound was swallowed by another groan from the building's failing structure, and Elena knew that whatever happened next, whatever consequences awaited her, she couldn't walk away from the voices still calling for help in the darkness. The building shuddered around her as she made her way back to the communications room, and Elena realized that she might have finally pushed too far, challenged one order too many. The question that haunted her as she pressed deeper into the smoke and flames wasn't whether she would survive the next few minutes, it was whether anyone would understand why she had to try. Elena Vasquez had never planned to become the kind of officer who questioned orders. Growing up in East Los Angeles, the daughter of a single mother who cleaned office buildings at night and took in laundry during the day, Elena had learned early that rules existed for a reason. Structure meant survival. Discipline meant opportunity. The military had offered her a way out of the endless cycle of poverty that had claimed so many of her childhood friends, and she had embraced every aspect of service with the fervor of a convert. At 18, she had been a model cadet at West Point, graduating in the top 10% of her class with commendations for leadership and tactical excellence. Her instructors had praised her analytical mind and her ability to remain calm under pressure. Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Hayes, her tactics instructor, had written in Elena's evaluation, "Vasquez possesses the rare combination of strategic thinking and tactical flexibility that marks the finest military minds. She will be an asset to any command." But somewhere between the polished halls of West Point and the dusty forward operating bases of Afghanistan, Elena had learned that the rules didn't always account for the human cost of following them blindly. Her First deployment had been a textbook operation training Afghan police forces in counterinsurgency tactics, establishing secure perimeters, building relationships with local tribal leaders. Elena had followed every protocol, filed every report on schedule, and earned praise from her superiors for her professionalism and attention to detail. The incident that changed everything had happened during her second tour, in a small valley north of Kandahar, where her unit was tasked with protecting a medical clinic that served 3 villages. The clinic was run by Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a civilian contractor from Doctors Without Borders who had been working in the region for 5 years. Dr. Mitchell was everything Elena admired: competent, fearless, and completely dedicated to her mission of providing healthcare to people who had none. The attack had come at dawn, just like today's explosion. Elena remembered the sound of incoming mortar, the scattered crack of small arms fire, the screams of wounded civilians caught in the crossfire. Her orders had been clear: protect the base perimeter, wait for reinforcements, do not pursue hostile forces without authorization. But Dr. Mitchell had been caught in the clinic when the shooting started, along with 2 nurses and a dozen patients, including several children. Elena had watched through her binoculars as smoke began rising from the clinic building, had heard the radio chatter about possible insurgent positions in the surrounding hills, had received increasingly urgent messages to maintain defensive positions and wait for air support. The air support had never come. A sandstorm had grounded the helicopters, and the nearest backup unit was 3 hours away. Elena had followed orders, maintained the perimeter, and watched the clinic burn. By the time the all-clear was given, Dr. Mitchell and 4 others were dead, killed not by enemy fire but by smoke inhalation as they waited for a rescue that came too late. The official report had praised Elena's adherence to protocol under difficult circumstances. Her commanding officer had recommended her for promotion. But Elena had stood at Dr. Mitchell's memorial service, listening to tributes from colleagues and family members, and felt something fundamental crack inside her chest. That night, she had called her mother from the base communication center, needing to hear a familiar voice, needing some anchor to help her make sense of what had happened. "Mia," her mother had said in that gentle way she had of reading Elena's moods even across thousands of miles, "you sound like you're carrying the whole world on your shoulders." "I followed orders, Mama," Elena had whispered into the phone. Aware that her conversations were monitored, but needing to say the words anyway, "I did exactly what I was supposed to do." "And that's eating you up inside," her mother had replied. It wasn't a question. Elena had tried to explain about military discipline, about the importance of following the chain of command, about how individual actions could jeopardize larger operations. But the words had sounded hollow even to her own ears. "When you were 7 and Mrs. Contreras' house caught fire?" her mother had asked. "You ran inside to get her cat before the fire department arrived. You didn't ask permission. You didn't wait for someone to tell you it was safe. You just did what needed to be done." "That was different, Mama. I was a kid." "No, Mia, that was who you are. The uniform doesn't change that." The conversation had lasted another 20 minutes, but Elena had barely heard the rest of it. Her mother's words had lodged themselves in her consciousness like a splinter, uncomfortable and impossible to ignore. After that deployment, Elena had found herself caught between 2 competing versions of herself. There was the officer who followed orders, filed reports, and earned commendations for her tactical competence. And there was the woman who remembered Dr. Mitchell's laugh, who could still hear the sound of children crying in a burning building, who understood that sometimes following rules meant abandoning the very people you had sworn to protect. The tension had manifested in small ways at first. Elena had begun questioning orders more frequently, pushing back against strategies that seemed inefficient or dangerous to civilian populations. Her superiors had initially welcomed her input, Tactical flexibility was prized in counterinsurgency operations, but as her challenges became more frequent and more pointed, their patience had worn thin. During her third deployment, Elena had been assigned to a unit tasked with training local police forces in a region where Taliban influence was growing. Her commanding officer, Colonel Robert Dawson, was a veteran of Iraq and Afghanistan who believed firmly in the doctrine of overwhelming force. His strategy for dealing with insurgent activity was simple: identify potential threats, neutralize them quickly, worry about civilian casualties later. Elena had watched Dawson's tactics alienate the very population they were supposed to be protecting. Heavy-handed raids had turned potential allies into enemies. Arbitrary detention of suspected insurgents had created martyrs and recruiting tools for the Taliban. Elena had tried to raise these concerns through proper channels, had written detailed reports outlining alternative approaches. Based on successful counterinsurgency models from other theaters, Dawson's response had been swift and decisive. Elena had found herself assigned to increasingly peripheral roles, removed from tactical planning sessions, excluded from operations where her input might have made a difference. The message was clear: officers who couldn't follow orders without question weren't welcome in positions of responsibility. The breaking point had come during what was supposed to be a routine patrol through a market district in Jalabad. Elena's squad had been conducting a presence patrol, showing the flag and building relationships with local merchants, when they received reports of a possible improvised explosive device in the area. Standard procedure called for immediate evacuation of civilian populations and deployment of an explosive ordnance disposal team. But the EOD unit was 40 minutes away, and Elena could see that panic was already spreading through the crowded marketplace. People were running, pushing, falling. She watched an elderly man get knocked down by the crowd, saw children being separated from their parents in the chaos. Elena had made a decision that would haunt her for months afterward. Instead of waiting for the EAD team, she had approached the suspicious package herself, using her basic demolitions training to assess the threat. The device had turned out to be a false alarm, a broken radio wrapped in electrical tape, but her decision to investigate without authorization had violated half a dozen safety protocols. Colonel Dawson had been livid. Elena had been formally reprimanded, removed from field operations, and assigned to desk duty for the remainder of her deployment. The official notation in her file had been damning: failure to follow direct orders, disregard for established safety protocols, unsuitable for independent command responsibility. But Elena had also received an unofficial commendation from the local police chief, who had written to thank her for preventing what could have been a deadly stampede. The letter, written in broken English but full of genuine gratitude, had meant more to Elena than any military decoration. The pattern had continued through her subsequent assignments. Elena would excel in routine operations, earn praise for her technical competence and leadership skills, then find herself in conflict with superiors when situations demanded strict adherence to protocols that seemed divorced from ground level reality. Her assignment to General Harrington's command had been presented as an opportunity for career rehabilitation. Harrington was known as a fair but demanding commander, someone who valued both tactical excellence and military discipline. Elena had hoped that serving under him would help her find a way to reconcile her conflicting impulses. Instead, she had found in Harrington everything she had come to distrust about military leadership. He was competent, experienced, and absolutely certain that his way of doing things was not just correct, but morally superior. He viewed Elena's tendency to question orders as a character flaw rather than a tactical consideration. Their first major clash had occurred during a joint operation with Afghan National Army forces to clear a Taliban stronghold in a mountainous region near the Pakistani border. Intelligence had indicated that the compound contained high-value targets, But Elena had noticed discrepancies in the surveillance reports that suggested the intelligence might be outdated. She had raised her concerns with Harrington, suggesting additional reconnaissance before launching the assault. Harrington had listened to her presentation with the kind of polite attention that military protocol demanded. The compound had indeed been occupied, but not by Taliban fighters instead. Elena's unit had found themselves engaging a wedding party that had been using the abandoned building for their celebration. By the time the mistake was realized, 3 civilians were dead and 7 more were wounded, including 2 children. Elena had filed a detailed after-action report outlining the intelligence failures that had led to the tragedy, including specific recommendations for improving future operations. Harrington had filed his own report that praised the unit's tactical execution while describing the civilian casualties as an unfortunate but unavoidable consequence of operating in a complex environment. The 2 reports had painted completely different pictures of the same event. Elena's version had focused on systemic failures and lessons learned. Harrington's had emphasized mission success and the need to accept collateral damage as a reality of modern warfare. When Elena had requested clarification about which report would be forwarded to higher command, Harrington had made his position clear. Captain Vasquez, your job is to execute missions, not to second-guess the intelligence that makes those missions possible. If you're not comfortable with that reality, perhaps you should consider whether military service is the right career path for you. The conversation had taken place in Harrington's office on a sweltering afternoon in July. Outside the window, Elena could see soldiers going about their daily routines, maintenance crews working on vehicles, supply personnel organizing shipments, communications specialists monitoring radio traffic. All of them trusting that their leaders would make decisions based on the best available information and the welfare of their subordinates. Elena had stood at attention, staring at the map of Afghanistan mounted on Harrington's wall, marked with pins indicating friendly positions, enemy strongholds, and civilian population centers. The map looked so clean and organized from that perspective, reduced to symbols and colored lines that made the chaos of ground-level operations seem manageable and predictable. Sir, I believe my concerns about intelligence verification are consistent with established tactical doctrine, Elena had said, choosing her words carefully. Your concerns, Captain, are symptomatic of a larger problem with your approach to military service, Harrington had replied. You seem to believe that every order, every mission, every decision is subject to your personal approval. That's not how armies function. Elena had wanted to argue to point out that tactical flexibility and critical thinking were emphasized in every military leadership manual she had ever read. But she had also recognized the futility of continuing the conversation. Harrington wasn't interested in debate. He was establishing boundaries. The incident had marked the beginning of what Elena privately thought of as her probationary period under Harrington's command. She had been assigned to increasingly routine tasks, excluded from planning sessions, and gradually isolated from meaningful operational responsibilities. Her efficiency reports had been technically satisfactory, but lukewarm in their praise, the kind of evaluations that effectively ended military careers without providing grounds for appeal. Elena had known that her time at the base was limited long before Harrington had officially recommended her for transfer. The paperwork had been filed, the orders had been cut, and next week she would be flying back to the United States to begin a new assignment at the Pentagon, analyzing supply chain logistics for future deployments. The transfer represented everything Elena had tried to avoid when she had chosen military service as her career. She would be removed from the field, isolated from the soldiers she had sworn to lead, reduced to pushing paper and attending meetings about budgets and procurement schedules. It was a kind of professional death sentence, a signal to everyone in her chain of command that Captain Elena Vasquez was not considered suitable for positions of real responsibility. But as Elena had lain in her bunk, The night before the explosion. Staring at the ceiling and listening to the familiar sounds of a military base at rest, she had found herself thinking about her mother's words from that phone call years ago. The uniform doesn't change who you are. Tomorrow would bring her final day on the base, her last opportunity to serve alongside the soldiers who had become her extended family over the past 8 months. Sergeant Chun, with his dry sense of humor, and his encyclopedic knowledge of military history. Corman Rodriguez, who could patch up anything from combat wounds to broken hearts. Sergeant Santos, whose loyalty and competence had made Elena a better officer and a better person. Elena had tried to imagine herself explaining to them why she was leaving. Why following orders was more important than following instinct. Why career advancement mattered more than the messy, complicated work of actually protecting people. The conversations had played out in her mind like scenes from a nightmare, full of disappointment and disillusion and the kind of betrayal that couldn't be explained away with references to military protocol. She had drifted off to sleep still, wrestling with those imaginary conversations, still trying to find words that would make her transfer seem like something other than abandonment. In her dreams, she had been back in that burning clinic in Afghanistan, watching Dr. Mitchell disappear into the smoke while Elena stood frozen at her post, following orders that arrived too late to save anyone. Elena had awakened to the sound of explosion with her mother's words echoing in her mind. That was who you are. The uniform doesn't change that. Now, as she prepared to enter the burning building for what might be the last time, Elena realized that her mother had been right. The uniform had never changed who she was. It had only given her opportunities to choose between being the person she wanted to be and being the officer she was supposed to be. For 8 months, she had tried to be the officer General Harrington wanted. She had followed orders, filed reports, and kept her opinions to herself. She had prepared to accept transfer to a desk job, where her dangerous tendency to think for herself wouldn't threaten military discipline. But standing at the edge of that burning building, hearing voices calling for help from inside, Elena understood that some choices were bigger than career considerations. Some moments demanded that you choose between the person you were and the person you were afraid to be. The second trip back into the communications room felt like descending into hell itself. Elena's throat was raw from smoke inhalation. Her hands were cut and bleeding from moving debris, and every breath felt like inhaling liquid fire. But she could still hear voices, weaker now, more desperate, but unmistakably human and unmistakably calling for help. Behind her, she could hear General Harrington's voice rising above the chaos, no longer shouting orders, but actually pleading with her to evacuate. Captain Vasquez, the building is compromised. You're going to get yourself killed. Elena pressed deeper into the wreckage, following the sound of voices. The heat was becoming unbearable, and she could feel her protective gear starting to melt against her skin. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, to save herself, to follow the orders that made perfect sense from a tactical standpoint. But then she heard it. Voice she recognized. Specialist Amy Chun, Sergeant Chun's younger sister, who had arrived on base just 2 weeks ago as part of the communications team. Amy was barely 21, fresh out of technical training, still excited about her first deployment. Elena had seen her in the mess hall just yesterday, laughing at one of her brother's stories, her face bright with the kind of optimism that military service hadn't yet beaten out of her. Help! Someone please help! Amy's voice was getting weaker, but Elena could pinpoint its location now somewhere, beneath a collapsed section of ceiling in what had been the main communications hub. Elena began moving debris with systematic desperation, lifting chunks of concrete and twisted metal that should have been impossible for one person to handle. Adrenaline and determination had given her strength she didn't know she possessed, but she could feel that strength starting to ebb as the smoke and heat took their toll. Amy, keep talking. I'm coming. Elena called out, her voice hoarse and barely audible over the crackling of flames. "Captain? Captain Vasquez? Oh God, I thought everyone had forgotten about us." Amy's voice was closer now, and Elena could see movement beneath a section of collapsed wall. "Us?" Elena asked, still digging. "There are 3 of us down here, me, Corporal Washington, and Private Stevens. Stevens is hurt bad, ma'am. He's not talking anymore." Elena felt her heart sink. 3 more soldiers, one of them possibly dying. All of them depending on her to find a way to get them out before the building collapsed completely. She could hear the structure groaning around her, metal supports bending past their breaking points, concrete cracking under stress it was never designed to bear. Outside, the sound of activity was intensifying. Elena could hear fire trucks, ambulances, and what sounded like heavy equipment being deployed. The professional rescue teams were finally arriving, the ones with proper tools and training for exactly this kind of situation. The logical part of her mind knew that she should evacuate now, let the experts take over, save herself and trust that they would reach the trapped soldiers in time. But Elena had learned not to trust timing when lives were at stake. She had seen too many situations where in time turned out to be 5 minutes too late, where following proper procedure meant body bags instead of rescue victories. She managed to clear enough debris to create a small opening, and through it she could see Amy's face, streaked with soot and blood but alive and alert. Behind Amy, Elena could make out 2 other figures: Corporal Washington, who was conscious but appeared to have a severe leg injury, and Private Stevens, who was motionless and unnaturally pale. "Amy, I need you to listen carefully," Elena said, fighting to keep her voice calm and authoritative despite the chaos around them. "The building is about to collapse. We need to get you out of there right now. What about Stevens, ma'am? He's been unconscious for 10 minutes. I don't think he's breathing right." Elena's mind raced through the tactical equation. 3 soldiers, 1 unconscious and possibly dying, trapped in a space that was too small for her to enter and too unstable to support a prolonged rescue operation. The rational choice was to save the 2 she could reach, get them out quickly, and hope that professional rescue teams could extract Stevens before the building came down. But Elena had never been good at making rational choices when soldiers' lives were at stake. "We're getting all 3 of you out," she said firmly. "Amy, can Washington move on his own?" "I think so, ma'am. His leg is messed up, but he's conscious." "Good. I'm going to widen this opening. As soon as there's enough room, I want you and Washington to start moving Stevens toward me. We'll carry him out together." Elena attacked the debris with renewed fury, ignoring the pain in her hands and the burning in her lungs. She could hear voices behind her now, rescue workers who had finally reached the building, shouting for her to evacuate immediately. "Captain Vasquez." The voice belonged to Fire Chief Ronald Martinez, whom Elena recognized from base safety briefings. "The structural engineers say this building could collapse any second. We need you out of there now." "3 soldiers trapped in here, Chief," Elena shouted back without stopping her work. "Give me 5 more minutes." "Captain, I can't let you." 5 minutes. Elena's voice carried an authority that seemed to surprise even her. "Have your teams ready at the exit. We're bringing them out." The opening was finally wide enough for a person to crawl through. Elena squeezed into the tight space where the 3 soldiers were trapped, her body scraping against jagged metal and concrete. The air was thick with dust and smoke, and she had to feel her way through the darkness to locate Stevens. The young private was unconscious, his breathing shallow and irregular. Elena couldn't see the extent of his injuries in the poor light, but she could tell from the way he was positioned that he had been struck by falling debris. Moving him could cause additional injury, but leaving him would almost certainly mean death. "Washington, can you support Stevens' head and neck while we move him?" Elena asked. "Yes, ma'am," Washington replied through gritted teeth. His leg was clearly causing him significant pain, but he was still functioning, still following orders. "Amy." You take his legs, I'll take the middle. We move slow and steady, no sudden movements, no matter what happens outside. The extraction took agonizing minutes that felt like hours. The three of them worked in perfect coordination, maneuvering Stephen's unconscious form through the maze of debris while the building continued to groan and shift around them. Elena's world had narrowed to this single task: protect Stephen's spine, maintain steady movement, ignore the pain and the fear, and the growing certainty that they were running out of time. When they finally emerged from the communications room, Elena saw that the scene outside had transformed into a full-scale emergency response operation. Fire trucks were positioned around the building, their hoses spraying water onto the flames. Ambulances were lined up to receive casualties, their red and white lights painting everything in an eerie, pulsing glow. Medical personnel were working over the soldiers Elena and Santos had already evacuated, some preparing patients for transport to the base hospital, others working frantically to stabilize the most seriously wounded. And standing in the middle of it all, coordinating the response with the calm efficiency of a man who had seen too many crises to be rattled by one more, was General Harrington. Elena caught his eye as she and the others carried Stevens toward the waiting medics, and she saw something in his expression that she had never seen before. Not anger, not disappointment, but something that looked almost like fear. For a moment, their eyes locked across the chaos, and Elena realized that Harrington's opposition to her rescue attempts hadn't been about military discipline at all. It had been about something far more personal. The medics took Stevens from them with the brisk efficiency of professionals who had seen too many battlefield casualties. Elena watched as they began working to stabilize him, checking vitals, starting 4 lines, preparing him for emergency transport. She didn't know if he would survive, but she knew that he had a chance now, a chance he wouldn't have had if she had followed orders and waited for the proper rescue teams. Captain Vasquez. Harrington's voice cut through the noise like a blade. He was striding toward her, his face flushed with emotion that Elena couldn't quite identify. I want to see you immediately. Elena looked around at the controlled chaos of the rescue operation. Soldiers and medics were still working to evacuate the wounded. Fire crews were still battling the blaze that threatened to spread to other buildings, and she could see Santos emerging from another part of the structure with 2 more survivors. Sir, the operation isn't complete, Elena replied, her voice hoarse from smoke inhalation, but still steady. There may be more people trapped inside. The operation, Captain, is being handled by qualified personnel who have the proper equipment and training for this situation. Harrington stepped closer, his voice rising. Your unauthorized actions have compromised the safety of this entire rescue operation. Elena felt something snap inside her chest, not anger, exactly, but a kind of crystalline clarity that cut through the exhaustion and pain. She looked at the general, this man who had spent months trying to teach her the importance of following orders, and realized that they were having 2 completely different conversations. Sir, with respect, my actions have saved lives, she said quietly, but her voice carried clearly in the sudden silence that had fallen around them. Other soldiers had stopped what they were doing to watch the confrontation, sensing that something significant was happening between their captain and their commanding general. Your actions have violated direct orders and endangered rescue personnel. Harrington's voice cracked slightly, and Elena realized with shock that he was genuinely afraid, not for military discipline or proper procedure, but for her safety. That building could have collapsed with you inside it. Do you have any idea what that would have done to morale? To unit cohesion? Do you have any idea what it would have done to morale if I had stood here and watched soldiers burn to death while we waited for authorization? Elena shot back, her own voice rising despite her efforts to remain calm. These people aren't statistics in your reports, General. They're human beings with families and dreams and futures that depend on the decisions we make right here, right? Now Harrington's face had gone pale beneath the soot and grime. Captain, you are relieved of duty, effective immediately. Report to the base provost marshal for processing. The words hit Elena like a physical blow. Being relieved of duty in the middle of an emergency operation was more than just a disciplinary action. It was a public humiliation designed to send a message to every soldier watching that disobedience would not be tolerated, regardless of the circumstances. But before Elena could respond, Sergeant Santos stepped between them, her uniform torn and bloody, but her bearing still military crisp. "Sir, if you're relieving Captain Vasquez, you'll need to relieve me too. I was part of every unauthorized entry into that building." "And me, sir," added Corporal Rodriguez, moving to stand beside Santos. "Captain Vasquez's actions allowed me to treat wounded soldiers who would have died without immediate medical attention." "Sir, same here," came another voice. Sergeant Chen had appeared at Elena's shoulder, his usually cheerful face grim with determination. "I followed Captain Vasquez into that building multiple times. If she violated orders, then we all did." Elena watched in amazement as more soldiers stepped forward, communications specialists, mechanics, supply personnel, medics, engineers. Within minutes, nearly a dozen soldiers had publicly aligned themselves with her actions, effectively daring Harrington to relieve them all of duty in the middle of an emergency. The general looked around at the faces surrounding him, and Elena could see him calculating the impossibility of disciplining so many soldiers without crippling his own command structure. But she could also see something else in his expression, a growing recognition that his conflict with Elena had never really been about military discipline at all. Fire Chief Martinez chose that moment to interrupt the standoff. "General, sir, we need to clear this area immediately. The structural engineers are reporting critical stress fractures in Building C6. If it goes down, it could take the fuel depot with it." The mention of the fuel depot sent a chill through everyone present. The base's main fuel storage facility was located just 30 yards from the burning communications building, containing enough aviation fuel and diesel to level half the base if it ignited. Elena could see Harrington's mind shifting into crisis management mode, weighing tactical considerations against personal conflicts. "How much time do we have?" Harrington asked Martinez. "Could be minutes, could be hours," Martinez replied grimly. "The engineers can't get close enough to make a proper assessment while the building is still burning." Elena studied the tactical situation with the same analytical mind that had earned her commendations at West Point. The fuel depot was protected by concrete barriers and automatic suppression systems, but a large enough explosion could overwhelm those safeguards. If Building C6 collapsed in the wrong direction, the debris could rupture fuel lines and create exactly the kind of cascading disaster that military planners spent sleepless nights trying to prevent. "General," she said quietly, "I recommend immediate evacuation of all non-essential personnel to the secondary assembly area. Establish a command post at Building A12 and coordinate with base security to implement threat condition Delta protocols." Harrington stared at her for a long moment, and Elena could see the conflict playing out behind his eyes. Everything about her tactical assessment was sound. It was exactly what he would have recommended himself. But accepting her input meant acknowledging her competence as an officer, which complicated his decision to relieve her of duty. "Your recommendations are noted, Captain," he said finally, his voice carefully neutral. "But you are still relieved of." The ground shook beneath their feet as another explosion rocked the base, this one smaller but closer. Through the smoke and flames, Elena could see that a secondary gas line had ruptured, sending a pillar of fire shooting into the morning sky. The chain reaction that everyone had feared was beginning. "Sir, with respect, this isn't the time for personnel actions," Elena said, stepping closer to Harrington. "You need every experienced officer you have to manage this crisis. Deal with my insubordination after we've contained the situation." For a moment, the two of them stood face to face. And Elena could see Harrington wrestling with the same kind of impossible choice that had haunted her throughout her military career. Follow the rules and risk catastrophic consequences, or bend the rules and accept responsibility for the precedent that set. The decision was taken out of his hands by the arrival of Colonel Patricia Hayes, Elena's former tactics instructor from West Point, who had flown in that morning for a scheduled inspection of base security procedures. Hayes took in the situation with the quick assessment of a veteran officer, noting the burning building, the evacuation in progress, and the obvious tension between Elena and Harrington. "General Harrington," Hayes said briskly, "I need a tactical briefing on the current situation. What's our status?" Harrington straightened, his military bearing reasserting itself in the presence of a superior officer. "We have a fire in the communications building with potential for spread to the fuel depot. Captain Vasquez has been conducting unauthorized rescue operations in violation of direct orders." Hayes looked at Elena, and Elena saw recognition flicker in the colonel's eyes. "Captain Vasquez, from West Point class of 2018? "Yes, ma'am," Elena replied, coming to attention despite the chaos around them. "How many casualties have you extracted from the building, Captain?" 26 confirmed survivors, ma'am. 3 KIA that we know of." Hayes nodded grimly. "And the current status of the fire suppression efforts?" Elena glanced at Harrington, unsure whether she was authorized to answer. But Hayes was looking at her expectantly, and Elena realized that the colonel was conducting her own assessment of the situation. "Fire crews have contained the blaze to the original building, ma'am, but structural damage is threatening adjacent facilities. I've recommended immediate evacuation to secondary positions and implementation of threat condition delta protocols." "Your assessment of the risk to the fuel depot?" "Significant but manageable if we act quickly, ma'am. The main concern is cascading structural failure if Building C6 collapses." Hayes turned to Harrington. "General, what's your assessment of Captain Vasquez's tactical recommendations?" Harrington's jaw tightened. "Her recommendations are sound, Colonel, but they don't address the issue of her repeated insubordination." "I see." Hayes was quiet for a moment, studying both officers. "General, in your professional opinion, how many of those 26 soldiers would have survived if Captain Vasquez had followed standard evacuation protocols?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Elena watched Harrington's face as he grappled with the implications of answering honestly. Standard protocols would have required waiting for professional rescue teams, establishing secure perimeters, and ensuring that all safety procedures were followed before attempting any extractions. "Fewer," Harrington admitted finally, "significantly fewer." "And in your professional opinion, what is the primary duty of a military officer?" "To follow orders and accomplish the mission," Harrington replied automatically. "And when those two imperatives conflict?" Harrington was quiet for a long moment. "An officer must use her judgment to determine the best course of action in support of the larger mission, which, in this case, was preserving the lives of American soldiers." Hayes sighed. It wasn't a question. Elena watched the exchange with growing understanding. Colonel Hayes wasn't just conducting a tactical assessment. She was forcing Harrington to confront the contradictions in his own position. By his own admission, Elena's actions had saved lives. By his own definition, an officer's primary duty was to accomplish the mission. The only question was whether saving soldiers' lives qualified as mission accomplishment. "Colonel," Harrington said carefully, "I don't dispute the outcome of Captain Vasquez's actions. But military discipline requires that orders be followed, even when individual officers believe they have better judgment. If every captain decided for herself which orders to obey, we wouldn't have an army. And if every captain followed orders blindly without regard for changing circumstances, we wouldn't have victories." Hayes replied. "General, I've read Captain Vasquez's efficiency reports. Her tactical competence is unquestioned." Her leadership abilities are exemplary. The only consistent criticism in her file is her tendency to show initiative in crisis situations. Initiative that violates direct orders, Harrington began. Initiative that saves lives, Hayes interrupted. General, I'm not questioning your command authority or your right to discipline subordinates who violate orders. But I am questioning whether this is the appropriate time or circumstance for such discipline. As if to emphasize her point, another rumble shook the ground beneath them. In the distance, Elena could see that the fire had spread to a storage shed adjacent to the main building, sending up a new column of black smoke that drifted toward the fuel depot like a harbinger of disaster. "Ma'am," Elena said quietly, "permission to speak freely?" Hayes nodded. "This isn't about me or my career or my tendency to bend rules. This is about whether we're going to let more soldiers die while we debate military protocol. There are still people in that building, and there are other facilities at risk. We can sort out the command issues after we've dealt with the crisis." Elena could see the truth of her words settling over both superior officers. Whatever personal conflicts existed between her and Harrington, whatever questions needed to be resolved about military discipline and proper procedures, those issues were secondary to the immediate, tactical situation. Hayes made the decision with the kind of swift authority that Elena remembered from her West Point days. "General Harrington, I'm temporarily assuming operational command of this emergency response. Captain Vasquez, I want you to coordinate evacuation procedures with base security. General, I need you to liaise with fire suppression teams and establish communication protocols with higher command." The colonel's intervention had effectively tabled the disciplinary issue while putting Elena back in a position of operational responsibility. Elena could see that Harrington was frustrated by the development, but military protocol prevented him from challenging a superior officer's tactical decisions in the middle of an emergency. "Yes, ma'am," Elena said, relief flooding through her. "I'll coordinate with Sergeant Chen on evacuation routes and establish checkpoints at the secondary assembly areas." As Elena moved to carry out her orders, she caught Harrington watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. There was still conflict in his eyes, still disapproval of her methods, but there was something else too, something that looked almost like grudging respect. The next hour became a blur of coordinated activity. Elena worked with base security to establish evacuation routes that would move personnel away from potential blast zones while maintaining access for emergency vehicles. She coordinated with medical teams to establish triage areas for the wounded soldiers who were still being extracted from the wreckage. She helped establish communication protocols that would keep all units informed of changing tactical situations. Through it all, she was aware of Harrington watching her, assessing her performance under pressure, noting how other soldiers responded to her leadership. Elena tried to focus on the mission rather than the personal dynamics, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being evaluated for something more significant than her tactical competence. The crisis reached its peak when structural engineers confirmed that Building C6 was indeed in danger of collapse, and that the collapse could potentially rupture fuel lines serving the depot. Elena found herself working directly with Harrington to coordinate a controlled demolition that would bring the building down safely away from critical infrastructure. "Captain," Harrington said as they reviewed demolition plans with the engineering team, "your assessment of optimal placement for shaped charges?" Elena studied the structural diagrams, noting load-bearing supports and potential failure points. "Here, here, and here," she said, marking locations on the blueprint. "Sequential detonation with a 3-second delay between charges. The building should collapse inward, away from both the fuel depot and the medical facilities." Harrington nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Concur. Coordinate with the demolition team for implementation." It was the first time in months that he had asked for her tactical input without reservation. The first time he had treated her as a competent officer rather than a problematic subordinate. Elena realized that the crisis had stripped away all the personal conflicts and institutional politics, reducing their interaction to its most basic level: two professional soldiers, working together to accomplish a mission, the controlled demolition. Went exactly as planned. Building C6 came down in a carefully orchestrated sequence of explosions that sent dust and debris billowing skyward but left all adjacent structures intact. The immediate threat to the fuel depot was eliminated, and fire suppression teams were finally able to contain the original blaze dot as the dust settled and the immediate crisis passed. Elena found herself standing beside Harrington, watching the aftermath of the morning's events. Ambulances were still transporting wounded soldiers to the base hospital, but the situation had stabilized. The emergency was over. 31 survivors extracted from the buildings, Harrington said quietly. 3 confirmed KIA, 7 serious injuries, but everyone else is expected to make full recoveries. Elena nodded, thinking about the soldiers she had pulled from the wreckage, the faces she had seen in the darkness and smoke. Amy Chun was going to be fine. Stevens had been stabilized and was being flown to a military hospital in Germany for specialized treatment. Even Corporal Washington was expected to keep his leg. "Captain," Harrington said, his voice carefully formal, "I owe you an apology." Elena turned to look at him, surprised by the admission. "Your actions this morning saved lives that would have been lost if we had followed standard protocols," he continued. "That doesn't excuse the violation of direct orders, but it does put those violations in a different context." "Sir, I understand the position my actions put you in," Elena replied. "Military discipline requires consistency. If officers can pick and choose which orders to follow, the whole system breaks down. And if officers can't adapt to changing circumstances, soldiers die unnecessarily," Harrington said. "That's the paradox of military leadership, isn't it? We need rules that everyone follows, but we also need leaders who know when to break those rules." Elena studied his face, seeing something she had never noticed before: uncertainty, vulnerability, the weight of command decisions that had no perfect answers. She realized that Harrington's rigidity hadn't been born of inflexibility, but of fear of making the wrong choice, fear of setting dangerous precedents, fear of being responsible for consequences he couldn't control. "Sir, if I may," Elena said carefully, "I think the key is trust. Trust that officers will use good judgment when they bend rules. Trust that soldiers will understand the difference between necessary flexibility and arbitrary insubordination. And how do we build that? Trust when every decision is second-guessed and every outcome is analyzed for lessons learned." Harrington asked. Elena considered the question, thinking about her own journey from the rule-following cadet at West Point to the officer who had just spent the morning defying direct orders to save lives. "I think we build it by being willing to have conversations like this one, sir. By acknowledging that military leadership is more complicated than just following procedures." Harrington was quiet for a moment, watching emergency crews continue their cleanup efforts. "Colonel Hayes has recommended that your transfer orders be canceled," he said finally. Elena felt her heart skip. "Sir?" "She believes that officers with your tactical abilities and leadership qualities are too valuable to waste on desk jobs in Washington. She's requested that you be assigned to her staff for advanced tactical training." The offer represented everything. Elena had hoped for a chance to continue serving in the field, to lead soldiers in meaningful operations, to use her skills where they could make a difference. But she could also see the cost of accepting it. "What about our working relationship, sir? You've made it clear that you don't trust my judgment when it comes to following orders." Harrington smiled, and Elena realized it was the first time she had ever seen him look genuinely amused. "Captain, this morning you violated direct orders, endangered yourself and others, and created a disciplinary nightmare that I'm still going to have to explain to higher command." Elena waited for the rest of the rebuke. You also saved 31 lives and demonstrated exactly the kind of tactical leadership that the Army needs in complex operational environments, Harrington continued. I may not always agree with your methods, but I can't argue with your results. So, where does that leave us, sir? It leaves us with an understanding, Harrington said. You have my trust to make tactical decisions in crisis situations. In return, I need your commitment that you'll work within the system rather than around it whenever possible. Elena considered the offer. It wasn't everything she had wanted. There would still be conflicts. Still situations where following orders and saving lives would seem mutually exclusive. But it was a recognition that military leadership required more than blind obedience, that sometimes the right choice was the difficult choice. Understood, sir, she said. I accept the assignment. As they stood watching the sun climb higher over the base, Elena realized that the morning's events had changed more than just her career prospects. They had forced both her and Harrington to confront fundamental questions about leadership, duty, and the cost of following rules in a world that didn't always conform to military procedures. The explosion that had shattered the morning calm had also shattered some of the artificial barriers that had kept them from understanding each other. In the chaos and crisis, they had discovered that they shared the same basic commitment to protecting the soldiers under their command, even when they disagreed about methods. Elena knew that the conversation was far from over. There would be after-action reports to file, disciplinary procedures to navigate, and policies to review. But for the first time since arriving at the base, she felt like she and General Harrington were on the same side of something that mattered more than career advancement or military protocol. They were on the side of the soldiers who had been trapped in that burning building, the soldiers who were alive because someone had been willing to risk everything to reach them in time. The after-action briefing took place 12 hours later in the base conference room, a sterile space dominated by a long metal table and walls covered with tactical maps and organizational charts. Elena sat at one end of the table, still wearing the same uniform from the morning's crisis, now cleaned but bearing the permanent stains of smoke and blood that would serve as lasting reminders of the day's events. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Around the table sat the key players from the emergency response: General Harrington, Colonel Hayes, Fire Chief Martinez, Base Commander Colonel Thompson, who had flown in from Kabul, and representatives from the Army Criminal Investigation Division, who had been tasked with conducting the official inquiry into the explosion. Elena had spent the afternoon providing detailed statements to investigators, walking them through every decision she had made, every order she had violated, every life she had saved. The process had been exhausting and emotionally draining, but she had answered every question with complete honesty, knowing that her military career might depend on how thoroughly she could justify her actions. The preliminary investigation had revealed that the explosion had been caused by a catastrophic failure in the base's electrical system, triggered by a combination of aging infrastructure and unusually heavy power demands from recently installed communications equipment. It was exactly the kind of systemic failure that military engineers spent careers trying to prevent. The kind of accident that happened despite everyone following proper procedures and safety protocols. In other words, it was nobody's fault and everybody's responsibility. A perfect example of how complex systems could fail in ways that no amount of planning could completely prevent. Colonel Thompson opened the briefing with a summary of casualties and damage assessment. Final count: 34 soldiers directly affected by the explosion and subsequent fire. 3 KIA, Sergeant William Morrison, Specialist David Park, and Private First Class Jennifer Wells. 31 survivors, of whom 7 required emergency medical evacuation to Level 3 trauma centers. Elena felt each name like a physical blow. She had known all three of the soldiers who had died, had served with Morrison on previous deployments, had watched park work on vehicle maintenance with the kind of meticulous attention to detail that made him invaluable to his unit. Wells had been 19 years old, fresh out of basic training, still writing letters home to her mother every week. Preliminary damage assessment indicates total loss of the communications building, significant damage to adjacent structures, but no compromise of critical infrastructure, including the fuel depot or primary command facilities, Townsend continued. The controlled demolition of Building C6 prevented what could have been a catastrophic secondary explosion. Thompson looked directly at Elena. Captain Vasquez, the investigating team has some questions about your decision-making process during the emergency response. Elena straightened in her chair, preparing herself for the formal inquiry that she had known was coming. Yes, sir. I'm prepared to answer any questions, said Agent Sarah Kim, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who had been taking notes throughout. The preliminary interviews consulted her tablet. Captain, at approximately 0647 hours, you received a direct order from General Harrington to evacuate the area around Building C7. Can you explain your decision to disobey that order? Elena had rehearsed this moment in her mind dozens of times during the afternoon, trying to find words that would adequately explain the split-second decision that had defined everything that followed. Agent Kim, I made a tactical assessment that immediate action was required to save lives. I believed that waiting for proper rescue teams would result in preventable casualties. Were you aware that your actions violated established safety protocols and potentially endangered other personnel? Yes, ma'am. I was aware of the risks. And you proceeded anyway? Elena met Agent Kim's gaze steadily. I did. Agent Kim made a note on her tablet. Captain, during your service record review, we noted several previous incidents where you violated direct orders or deviated from established protocols. Can you explain this pattern of behavior? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Elena was aware that everyone in the room was watching her, waiting to see how she would justify what could easily be characterized as a career-long pattern of insubordination. Agent Kim, in each of those cases, I made tactical decisions based on ground-level conditions that weren't fully reflected in existing orders or protocols. I've always accepted responsibility for those decisions and their consequences, including the consequences for military discipline and unit cohesion. Elena felt the trap in the question. Any answer that justified her actions could be interpreted as undermining the authority structure that held military units together. Any answer that didn't justify them would make her look like a reckless officer who put her own judgment above proper command authority. Before Elena could respond, Colonel Hayes leaned forward. Agent Kim, if I may interrupt, I'd like to provide some context for Captain Vasquez's service record. Agent Kim nodded for Hayes to proceed. I was Captain Vasquez's tactics instructor at West Point, and I've followed her career with considerable interest. The incidents you're referring to share a common thread. They all involved situations where rigid adherence to existing protocols would have resulted in unnecessary casualties or mission failure. Hayes opened a file folder and began reading. Afghanistan 2022. Captain Vasquez led an unauthorized rescue mission to extract a wounded interpreter from a hostile village. The mission succeeded in saving the interpreter's life and gathered valuable intelligence that prevented a planned attack on coalition forces. Elena remembered that mission vividly, the fear in the interpreter's eyes as they pulled him from the building where he had been hiding, the intelligence documents he had risked his life to preserve, the look of relief on his face when he realized he was safe. Iraq, 2023. Captain Vasquez violated standing orders about civilian interaction to provide medical assistance to a family caught in crossfire during an insurgent attack. Her actions led to the capture of 3 high-value targets and prevented what intelligence analysis indicated would have been a major terrorist operation. Hayes looked up from the file. Agent Kim, in each case, Captain Vasquez's decisions were tactically sound and strategically beneficial. The only question is whether the Army values tactical flexibility or procedural compliance more highly. Agent Kim made more notes. Colonel Hayes, are you saying that violation of direct orders is acceptable if the outcome is positive? I'm saying that military leadership requires the ability to adapt to changing circumstances, and that sometimes adaptation requires deviation from established procedures. The key is ensuring that such deviations are based on sound tactical judgment rather than personal preference or emotional reaction. General Harrington had been silent throughout the exchange, but now he cleared his throat. Agent Kim, I'd like to add something to the record. Yes, sir. This morning, I gave Captain Vasquez direct orders to evacuate the emergency area. She disobeyed those orders, and I was prepared to initiate disciplinary proceedings against her for insubordination. Elena felt her stomach clench. Despite the positive tone of the briefing so far, she realized that Harrington could still recommend court-martial proceedings that would end her military career. However, Harrington continued, subsequent events have forced me to reconsider my assessment of her actions. The 31 soldiers who survived the building collapse are alive today because Captain Vasquez was willing to risk her own life and career to reach them before professional rescue teams arrived. Harrington looked directly at Elena. Captain, I still believe that military discipline requires adherence to proper chain of command. But I also believe that leadership requires the courage to make difficult decisions when lives are at stake. This morning, you demonstrated both tactical competence and moral courage under extreme pressure. The room was quiet for a moment as the implications of Harrington's statements settled over everyone present. Elena realized that she was witnessing something rare in military culture, a superior officer publicly acknowledging that a subordinate's disobedience had been justified by circumstances. Colonel Thompson consulted his own notes. Captain Vasquez, the preliminary investigation has identified several factors that contributed to your success in extracting survivors from the building. Can you walk us through your tactical assessment of the situation? Elena gathered her thoughts, trying to organize the chaos of the morning into something that resembled a coherent tactical analysis. Sir, my primary assessment was that the building structure was compromised, but not yet critical. I estimated that we had a window of perhaps 20 to 30 minutes before complete collapse, which was sufficient time for multiple extraction operations if conducted efficiently. What informed that assessment? The pattern of structural damage, sir. The explosion had compromised primary support beams, but secondary supports were still functioning. I could see that the building was settling gradually rather than failing catastrophically. Thompson nodded. And your assessment of the risks to rescue personnel? Significant but manageable, sir. The primary risks were smoke inhalation, burns, and injury from falling debris. Those risks had to be weighed against the certainty that trapped personnel would die if we waited for standard rescue protocols. Agent Kim looked up from her notes. Captain, did you consider the possibility that your unauthorized rescue attempts could interfere with professional rescue operations? Yes. MAAM. I coordinated with Fire Chief Martinez to ensure that our operations didn't conflict with his team's efforts. We also established clear evacuation routes and communication protocols to avoid confusion. Fire Chief Martinez spoke up for the first time. Agent Kim, if I may, Captain Vasquez's actions actually facilitated our rescue operations. Her initial assessment of the building's structural status was accurate, and her evacuation of the most accessible victims allowed my teams to focus on the more difficult extractions. So you supported her decision to enter the building without authorization? Martinez was quiet for a moment, clearly weighing his words carefully. "Ma'am, in emergency response situations, we often have to make split-second decisions based on incomplete information." Captain Vasquez made tactical assessments that proved to be correct, and her actions saved lives that would have been lost if we had followed standard protocols. Colonel Hayes leaned forward again. "Agent Kim, I think we need to address the fundamental question here. Is the Army investigating Captain Vasquez for insubordination, or are we trying to understand how to better prepare officers for complex emergency situations where existing protocols may be inadequate?" The question cut to the heart of Elena's dilemma throughout her military career. Every time she had bent rules or challenged orders, she had been caught between competing definitions of what it meant to be a good officer. Was it more important to follow commands without question, or to exercise independent judgment when circumstances demanded it? Agent Kim consulted her tablet again. "Colonel, the investigation is focusing on whether Captain Vasquez's actions constitute a pattern of behavior that undermines military discipline and command authority." "And what have you concluded?" "That's still under review. However, the outcome of today's events certainly complicates any disciplinary recommendations." Elena realized that her fate was hanging in the balance of a bureaucratic calculation that had little to do with the soldiers she had saved or the risks she had taken. The Army was trying to decide whether her actions represented commendable initiative or dangerous insubordination, and that decision would determine not just her own career but the precedent for how future officers should handle similar situations. Colonel Thompson looked around the table. "I think we need to hear from some of the soldiers who were directly affected by Captain Vasquez's actions." "Agent Kim, I assume you've interviewed the survivors?" "Yes, sir. We have detailed statements from all 31 survivors." "And what did they tell you?" Agent Kim scrolled through her notes. "Unanimous praise for Captain Vasquez's actions, sir. Multiple statements indicating that they believed they would have died without her intervention. Several soldiers specifically noted that she endangered her own life to save theirs." Thompson nodded. "Any criticism of her methods or concerns about her violation of orders?" "None, sir. The consistent theme in all interviews was gratitude and respect for her leadership under pressure." Elena felt a surge of emotion that she struggled to control. She had known that her actions had saved lives, but hearing it confirmed by official investigation gave those decisions a weight and validation that went beyond her own tactical assessment. General Harrington cleared his throat. "Colonel Thompson, if I may, I'd like to share something that I think is relevant to this investigation." "Proceed, General." "This morning, when Captain Vasquez first disobeyed my order to evacuate, I was focused on following proper emergency protocols. My primary concern was preventing a bad situation from becoming worse through unauthorized personnel actions." Harrington paused, and Elena could see him struggling with the admission he was about to make. "I was wrong," he said simply. "Not wrong about the importance of military discipline or proper chain of command, but wrong about the specific tactical situation we were facing. Captain Vasquez had a better understanding of the ground-level conditions than I did, and her assessment of the rescue possibilities was more accurate than mine." The room fell silent. Elena stared at Harrington, stunned by the public acknowledgement. That went far beyond anything she had expected. "General," Agent Kim said carefully, "are you saying that Captain Vasquez's disobedience was justified?" "I'm saying that Captain Vasquez made the right tactical decision under extremely difficult circumstances. Whether that disobedience was justified is a question for higher command to determine, but the outcome speaks for itself." Colonel Hayes stood up, and Elena sensed that something significant was about to happen. "Agent Kim, Colonel Thompson, I've been authorized by the Chief of Staff to make a recommendation regarding Captain Vasquez's case," Hayes said, opening an official-looking document. Elena felt her heart racing. The Chief of Staff was the highest-ranking officer in the Army, and his involvement suggested that her case had attracted attention at the very highest levels of military command. The Chief of Staff has reviewed the preliminary reports of today's events, including the casualty assessments and the tactical analysis of Captain Vasquez's actions. He has asked me to convey the following message. Hayes began reading from the document. Captain Elena Vasquez demonstrated exceptional tactical leadership and moral courage in a crisis situation that demanded immediate action to save lives. Her willingness to risk her own safety and career to rescue fellow soldiers embodies the highest traditions of military service. Elena could hardly believe what she was hearing. Instead of court-martial proceedings, she was receiving official recognition from the Army's senior leadership. Furthermore, Hayes continued, the Chief of Staff has directed that Captain Vasquez's actions be studied as a case example in advanced tactical leadership courses to help train future officers in the kind of adaptive decision-making that complex operational environments require. The document was passed around the table for everyone to review. Elena read her own name in official correspondence from the Chief of Staff with a sense of unreality, as if she were reading about someone else's career. There is, however, one additional directive, Hayes said, her tone becoming more serious. The Chief of Staff has also ordered a comprehensive review of emergency response protocols to determine whether existing procedures adequately account for the kind of situation Captain Vasquez faced this morning. Agent Kim looked up from the document. What does that mean for the investigation? It means that instead of investigating Captain Vasquez for insubordination, we're going to be studying her actions to improve Army-wide emergency response capabilities. Hayes replied, her tactical decisions will be analyzed not as violations of protocol, but as innovations in crisis leadership. Elena felt overwhelmed by the reversal of fortune. 24 hours ago, she had been preparing for transfer to a desk job that would effectively end her field career. Now she was being held up as an example of tactical excellence by the Army's senior leadership, but she was also aware that the recognition came with expectations and responsibilities that extended far beyond her own career advancement. Ma'am, Elena said, addressing Colonel Hayes, I appreciate the recognition, but I want to be clear about something. I didn't violate orders because I thought I knew better than my superiors. I violated orders because I believed that following them would result in unnecessary deaths. Explain the distinction, Captain. Military discipline exists to enable effective operations, not to prevent them. When circumstances arise where following existing orders would undermine the mission, officers have a responsibility to adapt. But that adaptation has to be based on tactical necessity, not personal preference. Hayes nodded approvingly. That's exactly the kind of thinking that the Chief of Staff once incorporated into our leadership training. The ability to distinguish between necessary flexibility and arbitrary insubordination. General Harrington spoke up again. Captain, I have one more thing to add to the record. He stood up, his bearing formal but his expression softer than Elena had ever seen it. This morning, I was prepared to end your military career because I believed your tendency to question orders made you unsuitable for command responsibility. Elena braced herself for what felt like another reversal. I was wrong about that too, Harrington continued. Your willingness to question orders isn't a character flaw. It's exactly the kind of critical thinking that military leadership requires. The Army doesn't need officers who follow orders blindly. We need officers who understand the purpose behind orders and who can adapt when circumstances change. He looked directly at Elena. Captain, I would be honored to have you serve under my command, and I hope you'll consider staying at this base rather than accepting transfer to Colonel Hayes' staff. Elena felt tears threatening for the first time since the morning's crisis. The offer represented more than professional validation. It was an acknowledgement that she and Harrington had found a way to bridge the gap between their different approaches to military leadership. Sir, I appreciate the offer, but I think Colonel Hayes' training program is where I can make the biggest contribution. If my experience can help other officers navigate similar situations, Then that's where I belong." Harrington nodded, and Elena could see respect in his eyes. "I understand, Captain. And I think you're making the right choice." Colonel Thompson closed his folder and looked around the table. "Agent Kim, based on the testimony we've heard today, what's your recommendation regarding disciplinary action?" Agent Kim had been taking notes throughout the discussion, and Elena could see her weighing the complex balance of factors that would determine the final outcome. "Sir, I recommend that no disciplinary action be taken against Captain Vasquez. Her actions, while technically in violation of direct orders, were tactically sound and resulted in the preservation of life. The circumstances were extraordinary, and her decisions were consistent with the Army's core values and mission priorities." Thompson nodded, agreed. "Captain Vasquez, you are officially cleared of any charges related to today's events. Furthermore, I'm recommending you for the Army Commendation Medal for exceptional leadership under fire." Elena felt the weight of months of uncertainty lift from her shoulders. The recognition was gratifying, but more important was the validation that her approach to military leadership had merit, that there was room in the Army for officers who could think independently, while still respecting command authority. As the formal briefing concluded and participants began filing out of the conference room, Elena found herself alone with General Harrington for a moment. "Captain," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology that goes beyond what I said in the official proceedings, sir. I let my concerns about military discipline blind me to your genuine competence as an officer. I spent so much time trying to make you conform to my idea of proper military behavior that I failed to recognize the value of your unique perspective." Elena considered his words carefully. "General, I understand why my actions concerned you. Military effectiveness does depend on soldiers following orders, and I know that my tendency to question those orders creates challenges for command authority. But military effectiveness also depends on having leaders who can think critically and adapt to changing circumstances." Harrington replied, "The best officers throughout military history have been the ones who knew when to follow orders and when to exercise independent judgment. The challenge is knowing the difference." Elena said. The morning of Elena's 96th birthday dawned clear and cold over Carlisle, Pennsylvania. She woke before sunrise, as she had every day for 7 decades of military discipline, and made her way slowly to the kitchen to prepare coffee. Through her window, she could see the first hints of light touching the distant mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded her of other dawns in other places, when she had been young and certain that courage was simply a matter of running toward danger. At exactly 0800 hours, her phone rang. The caller ID showed unknown, but when Elena answered, she heard the voice of the current Secretary of Defense. "General Vasquez, this is Secretary Martinez. I'm calling to inform you that the President has approved the establishment of the Elena Vasquez Institute for Military Leadership. The groundbreaking ceremony is scheduled for next month at West Point." Elena felt her breath catch. At 96, she thought she was beyond surprise, but the magnitude of this honor overwhelmed her. "Mr. Secretary, I'm deeply grateful, but I want to ensure that the Institute honors not just my work, but the sacrifices of all the soldiers whose experiences shaped these programs. General, that's exactly why the President wanted to speak with you personally about this. He'll be calling you this afternoon." After the call ended, Elena sat in her kitchen, thinking about the impossible journey from that terrified captain facing court-martial to an old woman whose name would be permanently associated with military leadership development. But more than personal recognition, the Institute represented the institutionalization of lessons learned through tragedy, struggle, and the gradual understanding that military service was ultimately about human beings taking care of each other. At noon, Elena's great-niece Maria arrived for their traditional birthday lunch. Now a major with 2 combat deployments behind her, Maria had grown into exactly the kind of officer Elena had hoped to help develop, confident, without arrogance, decisive without recklessness, committed to both mission accomplishment and soldier welfare. Aunt Elena, Maria said as they sat down to eat, I wanted you to know that my unit successfully completed a civilian evacuation mission last month using TEDF protocols. We had to adapt our orders 3 times based on changing conditions, and because my commander and I shared the same decision-making framework, we were able to coordinate those adaptations without confusion or delay. Elena smiled, seeing in Maria's words the vindication of everything she had worked to achieve. Maria, that's exactly what the training was designed to accomplish. How many civilians were you able to evacuate? 417, ma'am, including 32 children under the age of 5. Elena felt tears forming in her eyes. 417 families were safe tonight because a young officer had been trained to think critically about orders while still working within command structure. 417 people were alive because lessons learned from an explosion 31 years ago had been translated into practical training that prepared leaders for adaptive decision-making. Maria, I want you to understand something. Those 417 people weren't saved by Elena Vasquez or the TEDF program. They were saved by you and your commander and your soldiers, using your courage and your judgment to protect people who needed help. Yes, ma'am. But we were able to do it because you and General Chun and all the others built something that prepared us for those moments. As the afternoon continued, Elena found herself thinking about the connections that linked individual decisions to institutional change, personal courage to collective wisdom, the weight of a single moment to the arc of an entire career. At 1500 hours, the phone rang again. This time, the caller ID showed White House. General Vasquez, this is President Williams. I wanted to call personally to congratulate you on your birthday and to thank you for a lifetime of service that has made our military stronger and our nation safer. Elena had met 3 presidents during her career, but speaking with the commander-in-chief still carried emotional weight that hadn't diminished with age. Mr. President, thank you for the honor of establishing the Institute. I hope it will continue to serve military leaders long after I'm gone. General, your legacy isn't just in the programs you developed or the awards that bear your name. Your legacy is in the thousands of officers who learned from your example that military leadership requires both courage and wisdom, that following orders and thinking independently aren't mutually exclusive. The President paused, and Elena could hear the weight of his own command responsibilities in the silence. General, I want you to know that your influence extends far beyond the military. The principles you developed have been adapted for use in civilian emergency management, corporate leadership development, and public policy implementation. You taught us that effective leadership in any context requires the ability to balance competing values and adapt to changing circumstances. After the call ended, Elena walked slowly to her study and opened the final file on her computer, a letter she had been writing to future military leaders intended to be released after her death as part of her final contribution to the profession she had served for so long. She read the closing paragraphs aloud, her voice strong despite her age. Leadership is not about perfect people making perfect decisions in perfect circumstances. It's about imperfect people doing their best to protect each other in an imperfect world, learning from their mistakes and passing those lessons on to the next generation. Every officer will face a moment when they have to choose between the person they are and the person they are afraid to be. When that moment comes, remember that the best military leaders are those who choose to be both good soldiers and good human beings. The explosion that changed my life 31 years ago was a single moment in time, but its consequences continue to ripple forward through every officer who has been trained to think critically about orders, every commander who trusts subordinates to exercise sound judgment, every soldier whose life has been saved by better prepared leadership. Military service is about more than following orders or accomplishing missions. It's about refusing to abandon hope even in the darkest circumstances. About finding courage not in the absence of fear, but in the determination to act despite it. Take care of each other. That's all any of us can do, and it's everything that matters. Elena closed the file and looked around her study one final time. On the walls hung photographs spanning 7 decades from her commissioning at West Point to her retirement ceremony. From the investigation that nearly ended her career to the congressional testimony that changed military doctrine. But the photograph that drew her attention was a simple one. 31 soldiers standing together at a reunion 5 years earlier. Their faces marked by age and experience, but their eyes still bright with the knowledge that they had survived when survival wasn't guaranteed. Elena picked up her phone and called Amy Chun one last time. Amy, it's been a good day. I know, Elena, the whole army knows. You've given us all something to celebrate. Amy, I want you to know that none of this would have been possible without your partnership and friendship. We built something together that will outlast both of us. Elena, we built something that will save lives for generations to come. That's not a bad legacy for 2 old soldiers. As the sun set over Carlisle that evening, Elena sat in her favorite chair reading letters from former students serving around the world. Each letter was a reminder that military service was ultimately about connections between human beings, mentor and student, commander and subordinate, veteran and recruit, the long chain of service that linked past and future through shared commitment to something larger than individual advancement. Elena fell asleep that night, thinking about the soldiers who would face impossible choices tomorrow, confident that they had been better prepared for those moments than she had been for hers, grateful that her own struggles and mistakes had contributed to their readiness and resilience. Her final conscious thought was of a young Captain 31. Years ago, standing outside a burning building and choosing to run toward danger instead of away from it, not knowing that choice would echo across decades in ways that made all the risk worthwhile. The next morning, Elena Vasquez was found peacefully in her chair, surrounded by photographs and letters from a lifetime of service, her face calm with the knowledge that she had given everything she had to something that mattered more than personal recognition or career advancement. She had given her life to the proposition that military leadership was about taking care of each other, and that proposition would continue to guide and inspire long after she was gone.